Hello, it's Scott Manley here, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the old Descent games, largely because somebody is trying to kickstarter a new version in the form of Descent Underground. Well, let's start out with Descent 1. And of course it starts out with a little text story, so I can do some voices here. And apparently our defense robots did not function to specifications. Our Pluto mining stations are now in unknown hands.
Worthless bureaucrats. They'll replace us all with robots given half a chance. Briefings are awful. Air is too sterile for human lungs. Endless electric blue schematics sting the eyes, and a suit from Post-Turin whose droning voice would make Armageddon sound boring. They needed me. They had the equipment. Why does he keep babbling?
We have an Israeli-made Pyro GX specially modified for this mission.
Fine, let me go. Some fighter jocks worship their hardware, but I'm not the religious type.
Okay, so you get the idea. There's a pretty long story. We could just skip through all this instead of me having to try to do the snidely voice. But yeah, so the idea is that you have a series of mines across the solar system, asteroid mines, and they have had, their automated systems taken over by some unknown force. And it's up to you as an expert pilot mercenary known as the Material Defender. It's up to you to take a day trip into these mines and deal with the locals as you see fit. And you could see a few of them here. Now, this game was released in 1994 originally. It was developed by Parallax Software and released as shareware for MS-DOS. Yes, this predates the modern Windows installs. All this was done through a software renderer at a resolution of 320 by 200. Although you did need a pretty impressive machine for the time to manage it, you definitely needed a 486 or even a Pentium processor to render it in all its glory. So this is it running under DOSBox. This is the good old games distribution. You can get Descent 1 and 2 together in a single package. They run under the DOSBox emulator. You can see in the top left that flashing red frame rate button is basically my video recorder, which is having some interesting interaction with DOSBox. Not sure what's causing that, but just ignore it. Anyway, although you're flying a spaceship, it's a lot more like a first-person shooter. And this, of course, was released shareware style pretty much within a year after Doom was originally released. Maybe slightly more than a year, but it's a huge step up technologically. Doom, of course, is only 2.5 dimensional. This is full 3-dimensional with 6 degrees of freedom motion. And, frankly, a lot of people at the time thought that it would be far too complicated for people to actually figure out how to fly these things correctly. It uses a series of deformed cubes to actually lay out the levels. It's very similar to the binary space partitioning algorithm that Doom used, of course, for level construction and rendering. But this is obviously lends itself much better to 3 dimensions. Although I say they're cubes, they are deformed cubes, so you would have very extreme deformations on the surface, and if there was nothing on the edge, then your rendering would continue through to the next block. Oh, there is, this is a little power restoration area, so I can restore my power. You have 10 weapons, 5 laser weapons, and 5 missile weapons that you can pick up during your explorations. 30 odd levels of this with many different kinds of enemies. The goal is to find this reactor core. Of course, deal with all the hostiles first. This is me using the Vulcan, which is a hit scan weapon instead, rather than the laser blaster, which travels at finite speed. Not sure how that works. Where I come from, light tends to travel faster than Vulcan rounds. But it's all in the name of gameplay, right? So here we go. Kill the core, and then the door opens and I can escape to victory. And we get a little, well, it's not really pre-rendered, but it's on rails as I escape into space, so I can travel on to the next target. A decent amount of points and everything, because points actually mattered in those days. There wasn't much in the way of narrative after the first few missions. You would go on from the moon to other planets through Venus and Mars, Even out to Pluto, because of course Pluto was still considered a planet back when this game was released. One other interesting thing I wanted to show you was the end screen, the do not distribute this as a commercial product, report the piracy. It tells you here's a bulletin board, the Interplay bulletin board, when you can dial in and download it. Yes, this was a game from the early 90s. But it was a success, and success breeds sequels, and so we have Descent 2. So the initial mission ends with you defeating all the robots, purging the solar system of the virus which is taking over everything, and of course leaving, heading out, expecting your pay package from the Post-Terran Mining Corporation. Now, of course, the sequel to a successful game meant they have more money, which meant they had the time and cash to develop proper full motion video segments. To explain the plot, you get to see yourself flying around in space using what would then be cutting edge graphics that you would have to send off and get, rendered, and it would then come back and incorporate it into the game. Of course, this stuff looks pretty primitive by today's standards. Could easily be done real time on a cell phone. The budget, of course, also allowed them to hire actual actors, so we get a chance to hear what the protagonist sounds like.
On approach to PTMC Outer Rim Station MIL 132. Request clearance to dock.
Vertigo 1, please confirm security clearance A7.
Affirmative. Transmitting now.
The video quality is actually pretty abysmal because of the technology available in 1996. But on top of this, they added a lot more to the game engine. They managed to double the resolution to 640 by 480. It actually also includes support for some primitive VR devices.
Welcome to Valhalla Tower, Material Defender. I trust your transfer to this station was recuperative.
Your concern is as underwhelming as ever, Dravis.
We have traced the alien infestation's vector from our holdings in the Zeta Aquila system, where we require you to gather reconnaissance information. We are fitting your ship with a warp drive prototype for the jump.
I've already fulfilled my contractual obligations, Dravis. I'm not doing any more of your dirty work.
Yes, your primary obligations have indeed been met, but if you study your standard mercenary agreement, you will notice that PTMC reserves the right to keep you on retainer for up to 72 hours post-mission.
Dravis, you son of a...
If you choose to decline further service, we may consider you in default of your contract, and your fee may be suspended pending litigation. Good luck, Material Defender. Dravis, out.
So there you have it. The sleazeball businessman has some clause in the contract, which means you can't quite leave just yet.
PTMC would find a way to cheat me.
Vertigo 1, proceed to jump point Alpha.
Yeah, I couldn't care less if they sue me. But they left me with no choice if I want my money.
Initiate a jump pre-sequence.
And here I thought indentured servitude ended in the 21st century. I only hope this is just a reconnaissance mission and nothing more.
Vertigo 1, you are cleared to proceed to Zeta Aquila.
Well, of course it's more than a reconnaissance mission. A reconnaissance mission wouldn't be particularly interesting for a game. No, it is taking the basic descent formula, they've turbocharged the graphics engine. After all, by 1996, everybody and their grandmother had a Pentium processor, right? And if they didn't, you can bet that they would be getting one soon when Quake was released and became the definitive FPS. Yes, it's easy to forget that Descent actually predates Quake. So yeah, again, this is the good old games version, whole bunch of options. You can see screen resolution of 640 by 480, or if I turn off the cockpit, I can get 800 by 600. And since it all runs under DOSBox, it does actually have a whole bunch of built-in scaling systems. I'm using a lot of the scaling options here to actually make this a little more watchable than it would otherwise be. Trust me, 320 by 240 or whatever is horrific. So yeah, we go through the usual list of entities. This is the guide bot. The guide bot is actually friendly, will actually help you find various items such as keys and the reactor and things like that. They won't help you find the prisoners. Obviously they are much more interested in getting the job done than they are getting the prisoners rescued. Also note that some of these have some animations on them now as well. Again, At the time, many first-person shooters were still using sprites for all their hostiles. This uses sprites for effects, it uses sprites for items and stuff on the ground, but the hostiles, or the other entities, are all properly rendered in 3D. So we shoot our way through this door to unleash the guide bot, and off it goes. What it's telling me is it's going to go and find the red key, so I should follow it if I want that. I'm not sure, I guess the bad guys don't shoot it because it seems to fly through relatively unscathed. I don't know if it's possible for me to shoot it by accident as well. Oh man, he's just not telling me that there's any bad guys around the corner here. It definitely plays a lot faster and a lot more smoothly, it feels, than the original Descent. But also, worth noting is the music has been turned from a chiptune soundtrack into something that has been professionally recorded. It even features some tracks by Type O Negative and members of Skinny Puppy. But underneath all this sheen and polish, higher resolutions, it really is exactly the same game. But of course, because, you know, they've tuned everything and made it better, it's absolutely a better game than Descent 1. It's fixed all the problems that you might have found, but it still does everything in software. And speaking of software, the developers did eventually release the code to the public under a license that essentially said you're not allowed to pirate it and everything else, you're not allowed to claim it as your own, but people did use it to make new and updated versions that would work for platforms that weren't originally supported and would work at resolutions not originally supported. Incidentally, the first two Descent games are one of the were actually ported to the Archimedes, which is pretty rare for games, so it's kind of cool to see that that was one of the few titles, mainstream titles I guess, that made this. I actually got this from Good Old Games as part of some deal where they basically sold all the Interplay games for like $35. And I honestly, I haven't played it a lot until the last couple of days when I saw the Descendant Kickstarter. Also note the escape sequence, again pre-rendered FMV this time, because it looks way classier. I mean, we all know doing flames and stuff like that is probably hard to do in the computers of the era, let's say. And finally we move on to Descent 3. Again, the same formula fundamentally in the game. It follows on directly from the previous game, but has a lot more plot to it. Your spacecraft is crippled, you're frozen, and yet, despite being frozen, you're falling into a sun. The sun. But this whole thing is a completely rebuilt engine. It was for Windows, originally released for Windows. It uses DirectX 3 to do all its 3D rendering. There is no longer a software renderer. And in fact, it means, bizarrely, that despite being designed for a newer operating system, it's a lot harder to get running correctly. I've got the Good Old Games version, and sometimes it works, and I have to poke around at it to make it work correctly. It flickers and things like that, but I had to switch to the OpenGL renderer, and then it seemed to work a whole lot better. So yeah, the studio that made Descent, what happened was they split into two groups. They split into Outrage, who continued to make Descent games. They made Descent 3, and the other half became Volition. And we know that Volition started out by developing one of the best spaceship shooters, Free Space. Well, Free Space 2 is really one of the best, and its engine has been reused for several fan projects, including the marvelous Diaspora Battlestar Galactica game based on the Free Space 2 engine. And while Outrage was closed down a few years after being acquired, Volition has continued, and they now run this little franchise called Saints Row. But forget that, this is Descent 3. Now, Descent 3, what happens is you get rescued, obviously, by some nice people. After all, nice people don't let pilots fall into the sun, right? You get rescued, you get taken to Mars, and then you start to find out a whole sort of interesting story about PTMC, the Post-Terran Mining Corporation, and their various nefarious schemes. Ultimately, you end up going to war, essentially, with the PTMC and destroying their orbital headquarters. Now, for actual in-game footage, I had some serious issues. It would crash all the time, so This is just an on-rails demo. All the games have the ability to play demos, so I managed to get this playing and capturing using the OpenGL driver, but capturing any other gameplay just didn't quite work for me. I'll figure it out, but I just wanted to include this in the video. It is actually a great game, and it has stood up well over time, I guess. It certainly has stood up better than the other Descent games, because the other Descent games use a software renderer. But of course all the games actually also stood out at the time, not just because of their 3D gameplay and their 6 degrees of freedom, but because they supported multiplayer particularly well early on. It wasn't uncommon to see a bunch of students playing it in the computer lab at the university. Anyway, the Descent games were absolutely undisputed classics, and they're worth checking out, and it is also worth checking out the Descendant Games Kickstarter. Maybe you want to back for an updated version of the game, maybe not, it's entirely up to you. If you just want to play the old games, they are on goodoldgames.com, check them out. I'm Scott Manley, fly safe.